Welcome to Anatomy of Blood Vessels Lab. I am Chuck Benton, instructor of Anatomy Physiology at Madison College. Before proceeding, let's quickly review the definitions of arteries and veins, as well as the significance of the red and blue color coding. Our definition of an artery is it takes blood away from the heart. The aorta, which supplies blood to the systemic circulation, and the pulmonary trunk, which supplies blood to the lungs, are examples of arteries. Veins return blood to the heart, the superior vena cava, bringing blood back from the systemic circulation, and the pulmonary veins bringing blood back from the lungs are examples of veins. Oxygenated blood, that is blood that is high in oxygen and low in carbon dioxide, is color-coded red, and blood vessels that carry oxygenated blood are color-coded red. Deoxygenated blood is blood that is low in oxygen, high in carbon dioxide, and blood vessels and portions of the heart that carry deoxygenated blood are color-coded blue. Also recall that the heart is really two pumps, with the right ventricle pumping deoxygenated blood to the lungs via the pulmonary arteries, and oxygenated blood returning to the left atrium via the pulmonary veins. The implications of this are that when we are talking about the blood vessels of the pulmonary circuit, the pulmonary veins are going to be the red color-coded blood vessels, and the pulmonary arteries are going to be the blue color-coded blood vessels. I want to emphasize this is only in the pulmonary circuit. So these are going to be the blood vessels that are sending blood to the lungs or bringing blood back from the lungs. The only blood vessels of the pulmonary circuit that you will be identifying are the pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins. Therefore, all other blood vessels will be from the systemic circuit. The systemic circuit takes oxygenated blood from the heart via the aorta. So we have oxygenated blood passing through arteries, which will be color-coded red, and deoxygenated blood returning via veins to the right atrium. In the systemic circulation, the arteries will be color-coded red and the veins will be color-coded blue. And except for the pulmonary arteries and veins, all of the blood vessels you'll be identifying will be of the systemic circulation. Let's start with the arteries. Here's the list from your study guide, and it may look like quite a large number of arteries that you have to identify, and it is. However, if you notice a few key features about arteries, they can be quite easy to learn in a very short period of time. First, the names of the arteries are very descriptive. They are named after the body regions in which they're found or nearby bones. So if you know your body regions, which you should, and your bones, which you also should, it becomes fairly easy to learn the names of these arteries. Second, realize that every time there is a branch, the artery changes its name. For example, let's say we have this long blood vessel or tube. And let's say at this point it has some name, artery X, let's call it. And then there's a branch. Then it will become artery Y. And then there's a branch and it'll change its name to artery Z. So every time there is a branch, the artery changes its name. Why does it do that? Well, it's so as a scientist or a clinician, we can be very specific as to where on that tube we are referring to. Something else we know about the blood of the systemic circulation can also help us in studying the arteries. We know, of course, that all blood of the systemic circulation leaves the heart by the aorta. That knowledge, with the knowledge that every time there's a branch, the artery changes its names, makes it very effective to study the arteries like roads on a map. We want to start here at the aorta and then follow the blood as it passes through blood vessels on its way to the head. Follow the blood as it passes through the aorta, through the shoulder, and then down to the upper appendages. Starting at the aorta and following blood as it descends into the abdominal region and then finally down to the lower appendages. Studying the arteries like roads on a map. Now let's put this method of studying the arteries into action. So we're going to learn the arteries of the upper appendages. We're going to start at the aorta. Notice that the heart's been removed, but we don't really need it. We know where it is. We're going to start at the aortic arch because we know that blood leaves the heart through the aortic arch, and we're going to follow that blood as it passes through the arteries on its way to the upper appendage. Blood leaves the aortic arch and enters the brachiocephalic artery. Now let's break that word down. Brachio refers to arm, cephalic refers to head. Notice that the blood passing through the brachiocephalic artery is headed toward the head and the arm, and that's where it gets its name. Now we're interested in the arm, so we're not going to follow that blood to the head, but that branch causes the artery to change its name. And so right after that branch, it becomes the right subclavian artery. Subclavian. Sub means below. Clavian refers to the clavicle. Notice that that artery dives below the clavicle, and that's where it gets its name. And right after it passes underneath the clavicle, there's a branch, and it changes its name to the axillary artery, named for the axillary region, the armpit. Then there's another branch, and it changes its name to the brachial artery. Then the artery right past the elbow divides and runs along the radius as the radial artery and along the ulna as the ulnar artery. So it's quite easy to learn the names of these arteries if we study them like roads. There are 3 arteries that supply blood to the head that you are responsible for knowing. So let's come back to the aorta and follow the blood on its journey toward the head. So coming off of the aorta, we have the brachiocephalic artery again, but this time we're going to follow the blood as it goes toward the head rather than the arm. So that branch becomes the common carotid artery. By the way, when you feel the carotid pulse in someone's neck, you're feeling the pressure wave of blood as it passes through that common carotid artery. The word common means that that blood vessel is going to split or divide and keep its same name. The common carotid artery divides into the internal carotid artery, which supplies blood to the deeper portions of the head, and the external carotid artery, which provides blood to the more superficial portions of the head. Before we continue looking at specific arteries, I want to address something you may have noticed on the study guide. For some of the arteries, I use the singular. For others, I use the plural, arteries. Same for veins. Sometimes I use veins, sometimes I use veins. the plural. What is the significance of that? If the blood vessels are symmetrical on both sides of the body, you do not have to use the adjectives left and right to describe them because they look the same on the right and left side. If they are asymmetrical, you will have to use the adjectives left and right. For those that are symmetrical, I use the plural on the study guide. For those that are not symmetrical, I used the singular form. Now, what do I mean by symmetrical on both sides? The human body basically has what is called bilateral symmetry. One side of our body is a mirror image of the other. And so structures on the right side in general look the same as structures on the left. There are, of course, some exceptions. We have a liver on the right side of the body. We don't have a liver on the left side. We have 3 lobes of the right lung. We only have 2 on the left. So there are some exceptions, and the blood vessels are no different. For most of the blood vessels, arteries and veins, they're symmetrical on both sides. And you'll notice that on your study guide, I use the plural forms for most. There are a few that are asymmetrical. And on the study guide, I used the left and right adjectives, and I also listed them singularly. For example, we can look at a few here that come right off of the aorta. Did you notice that there's a brachiocephalic artery on the right side, but there's not one on the left? Coming right off the aorta, we have the brachiocephalic artery. It then branches into a right subclavian artery and a right common carotid artery. Well, what about the left side? Well, we have no brachiocephalic artery. The left common carotid comes right off the aorta, and the left subclavian artery comes right off of the aorta. So they don't look the same on both sides of the body. They're asymmetrical. So for these, and these are most of the ones that are asymmetrical. I think there's 2 or 3 others actually that are remaining on your study guide. All right, for these, I do expect you to include left and right, except for the brachiocephalic because it's only on the right, and so it's understood. Now, your instructor may not hold you to this rule, and they may not care that you have to use the left and the right. So if you're not sure, ask your instructor. But for my students, I do expect for any blood vessel that is asymmetrical that they use the left and right adjectives in their answers. Now we're ready to study the arteries of the abdominal region. So again, we're going to start at the aorta, or the aortic arch rather, which then descends through the thoracic cavity as the thoracic aorta. It passes through the diaphragm into the abdominal region where it becomes the abdominal aorta. And then there are several arteries that extend from the abdominal aorta that you're responsible for knowing. We're following the aorta as it passes through the diaphragm into the abdominal cavity and becomes the abdominal aorta. There are several arteries that are going to branch from the abdominal aorta that you're responsible for knowing. First, coming off of the abdominal aorta is the celiac trunk. Now, you've already learned of the brachiocephalic trunk as well as the pulmonary trunk, but I've never actually defined what a trunk is. A trunk is nothing more than a short artery. It's an artery that almost immediately branches. And if you look at the celiac trunk here, it's very short. It immediately branches into 3 arteries of interest. One is the left gastric artery, which is supplying blood to the stomach. Gastro means stomach. This is the common hepatic artery. The common hepatic artery supplies blood to the liver. Hepato means liver. If you have hepatitis, you have inflammation of the liver. And lastly, we have the splenic artery. The splenic artery supplies blood to the spleen. The wonderful thing about these arteries is they're named after the visceral organs to which they supply blood. If I ask for any of these arteries, the splenic, the left gastric, or the common hepatic artery, I will always have the visceral organs present. I'll never have an image where it's just the naked blood vessel. If I ask for the left gastric artery, I'll always have the stomach there, or same for the splenic or the common hepatic artery. Also, you do have to include left with the left gastric artery because it is not symmetrical with the right gastric artery. Let's look at some additional arteries of the abdominal region that you must know. This is the renal artery. It supplies the kidney. Renal refers to kidney, thus its name. And again, I'll always have the kidneys present if I'm asking for you to identify the renal artery. There are, however, 3 arteries I could ask you to identify without the viscera, and more than likely I will ask you to identify them without the viscera because the viscera actually makes it a little more complicated and difficult to identify, as I'll show you in a moment. This is the celiac trunk. That's that same celiac trunk you saw a minute ago. Here the left gastric, common hepatic, and splenic arteries have been removed, and I could ask you to identify that celiac trunk without the viscera. Inferior to that is the superior mesenteric artery. Mesentery refers to the intestines. The superior mesenteric artery supplies blood to the small intestine and the proximal portion of the large intestine. Moving inferiorly, we have the inferior mesenteric artery. The inferior mesenteric artery supplies blood to the distal portion of the large intestine. This is an image of the mesenteric arteries, and you can see why I will not include the viscera when asking for those arteries. But here's the superior mesenteric artery here, and here is the inferior mesenteric artery here, supplying blood to the distal large intestine. Before we leave the abdominal region, I do want to point out the gonadal arteries, which supply blood to the gonads. If you know that you are looking at a male subject, you can refer to them as testicular arteries, and for females, ovarian arteries. But for the purposes of this lab, I am fine with gonadal artery. And finally, we've come to the arteries of the lower limbs. So we're going to follow that abdominal aorta as it extends into the pelvic region. There it splits into 2 common iliac arteries. The iliac artery, of course, is named for the iliac region, and we see the term common in its name, meaning that it's going to divide, and the 2 new divisions are going to retain that name. And indeed, that's what happens as we have the internal iliac artery here and the external iliac artery here. Now we're going to follow the external iliac artery as it passes into the thigh. There's a branch and it becomes the femoral artery. The femoral artery then continues to extend distally. Then there's a branch, and as it passes through the posterior knee, it becomes the popliteal artery. Now we're going to switch to this other image to the right here because it just shows a better image of the arteries of the leg. As that popliteal artery extends into the leg, it divides into an anterior tibial artery and a posterior tibial artery, both named for the nearby tibia bone. Now let's turn our attention to the veins. Veins, as you know, return blood to the heart. Veins start at the extremities of the body, where you have smaller veins that merge into larger veins, that merge into even larger veins, eventually returning blood to the right atrium. So, how should we study veins? We shouldn't study them like roads on a map, but more like rivers on a map. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, do you remember from social studies how rivers form? If we were to take a trip up into the mountains, we'd find that there is snow that's melting, forming little streams. And those little streams merge to form bigger streams. And then those bigger streams merge to form rivers. And then several small rivers merge and form even larger rivers. And eventually those rivers flow into the ocean. If we study the veins like rivers, we start at the extremities, such as the foot or the leg, and we learn the veins as they merge, and as they merge, they change names, and eventually all the blood being drained from the lower appendages eventually flow into the inferior vena cava, and for those parts of the body that are superior to the heart and the upper appendages, that blood eventually flows into the superior vena cava. So we study the veins in the exact opposite way that we studied the arteries. Now that you understand how we're going to learn the veins, let's look at the veins starting in the forearm and working our way back toward the heart. And one of the things you're going to notice quite quickly is that the veins have the same names as similar arteries in the same parts of the body. So once you learn the arteries, that's more than half the battle, because most of the veins have the same names. There are going to be a couple of more veins than arteries that you're going to learn, but it's just a few. So in the forearm, running along the ulna is the ulnar vein. Running along the radius is the radial vein. Those two veins merge to form the brachial vein. I want to call your attention to this vein here called the basilic vein. You don't have to know it, but it's going to merge with the brachial vein and form the axillary vein in just a moment. I do want to call your attention to the cephalic vein. The cephalic vein is a new vein. There's no similar, there wasn't a cephalic artery. So I'll put a little asterisk there to let you know, hey, this is new. The cephalic vein. The cephalic vein, cephalic means toward the head. So this is like sending blood toward the head. So that's one way you can remember it. The basilic vein and the brachial vein merge to form the axillary vein. That axillary vein and the cephalic vein merge to form the subclavian vein. The subclavian vein then merges with the external and internal jugulars, and the easy way to distinguish between the internal and the external is, well, the internal is more medial than the external. The internal and external jugular merge with the subclavian vein to form the brachiocephalic vein, and the two brachiocephalic veins merge to form the superior vena cava. And all of these veins are symmetrical on both sides, so you don't have to use left and right. One more thing I'd like to mention before we move to a different part of the body are the jugular veins. One of the most common errors students make is they mix up the jugular veins and the carotid arteries. I do from time to time get answers such as jugular arteries and carotid veins. Remember California carotid arteries and junior varsity jugular veins. Before we leave the upper appendage, I do want to discuss one additional vein, and that is the median cubital vein. This vein is found on the anterior elbow. It is a common site for withdrawal of blood for blood samples, as well as to place an IV. It's one that I'm sure you're familiar with. I put a little asterisk by it because there was no similar artery that you had to know. Let us now cover the veins of the lower limbs, starting with the leg. Here we have the anterior tibial vein and the posterior tibial vein. They merge and extend through the posterior knee as the popliteal vein. The popliteal vein merges with another vein to form the femoral vein. The femoral vein then merges with the great saphenous vein, and I starred this vein because we don't have a similar artery. Notice that this vein is large and long. It extends the entire length of the lower appendage on the medial side. The great saphenous vein merges with the femoral vein to form the external iliac vein. The external iliac vein merges with the internal iliac vein to form the common iliac vein. The two common iliac veins merge to form the inferior vena cava. In this figure, we're going to see a couple of veins of the abdominal region. Draining the kidneys are the renal veins, and draining the gonads are the gonadal veins. I will use this figure to illustrate the final abdominal veins. This is the inferior mesenteric vein. It drains blood from the distal large intestine. And here we have the superior mesenteric vein, which drains blood from the proximal large intestine as well as the small intestine. All blood that is drained by veins from the digestive organs of the abdominal cavity are taken to the liver by the hepatic portal vein. So the liver receives blood from all of the abdominal organs of the digestive tract. What that means is anything absorbed from the digestive tract goes to the liver first before it moves on to the systemic circulation. The liver detoxifies any potential toxins that are absorbed from the digestive tract. It also processes nutrients before the blood is then moves on to the inferior vena cava and the systemic circulation. I want to emphasize that this vein is the hepatic portal vein. If you call it anything else, if you leave out the word portal, it will be incorrect. The hepatic vein is another vein that actually takes blood from the liver to the inferior vena cava. So it is the hepatic portal vein. You can't leave off hepatic and you can't leave off the word portal. We have now come to our final topic, which is the microscopic anatomy of arteries and veins. In this image, you're looking at an artery on the left and a vein on the right. For the purposes of this lab, you can ignore the capillary in the center. We are looking now at the walls of arteries and veins. The walls of these blood vessels consist of 3 layers or tunics. Proceeding from the lumen side out, the innermost tunic is the tunica intima, also referred to as the tunica interna. This is the tunic that's in direct contact with the blood. You have this simple squamous layer of epithelial tissue supported by connective tissue. Notice that you have a layer of elastic tissue in the artery, giving it more elasticity compared to the vein. The second and middle tunic is the tunica media. This is where we have the biggest differences in the walls of arteries and veins. The tunica media consists of smooth muscle, but the smooth muscle is much thicker in the tunica media of the artery on the left compared to the vein on the right. This gives the artery a much greater degree or ability to vasoconstrict and vasodilate. It also contributes to the overall greater thickness of the wall of an artery compared to the wall of a vein. Arteries have to be more elastic than veins. They have to be able to stretch and recoil as the ventricles contract and relax. So we also find a little layer of elastic tissue in the tunica media of the artery. The last and final tunic, the outermost tunic, is the tunica externa. It's basically the same in both arteries and veins. Its purpose is simply to protect the deeper layers of these blood vessels. The final structure I would like to bring to your attention is found in veins. In veins, there's very low blood pressure, so there's very little pressure gradient driving blood through the veins. So to prevent the backflow of blood in the veins, similar to the prevention of backflow in the heart, veins have valves. You will not find valves in arteries, as there is a greater pressure gradient driving blood through arteries. Valves are only found in veins. After examining the components of the walls of blood vessels on an image, let's move to the model. Here we have an artery in the center flanked by veins on either side, and the walls have been dissected so you can see the various tunics. The innermost tunic is identified with the yellow arrow, the tunica intima. The middle tunic, tunica media, identified by the magenta arrow. Notice the smooth muscles. Notice they are significantly thicker in the artery compared to the vein. And the last tunic, the tunica externa, is shown by the black arrows. Also notice the valves of the vein. This concludes my presentation on the Anatomy of Blood Vessels lab. Next, use your Quizlets and other resources that have been prepared for you to study, learn, and master the anatomy of the blood vessels.